eyes, and that's why we call it a genocide. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. I've just switched on Twitch and Discord and YouTube. Welcome, everybody. I am going to keep TikTok on. I'm going to try and see. Welcome, everyone. Oh, wait. I am echoing here. I'm going to try and see if Twitch and YouTube and are perfectly fine with me reading this book. I'm going to see if TikTok is okay. If I get any warnings, I am going to switch off the sound and you can go to Twitch, YouTube, or Discord to continue reading with me. I will, Kitty, I will. I just have to, do the things. So we are on chapter 2 of Rape, a South African Nightmare. And I would like for you to continue tapping and sharing and doing all of those lovely things, because it helps protect the live. It helps do the things. So welcome in, everybody. Hi, Gonzo. It's good to see you as usual. And this section is going to rile up quite a few people because it is about race and rape. Chapter 2. What's race got to do with rape? There is a simple answer to the question posed in the title of this chapter. There's also a longer way to demonstrate it. The simple answer is everything. The idea of race as a way of seeing, defining, experiencing, and ordering the world is a recent one in human history, and it draws extensively on the creation of sexual difference and sexual violence. Race as an idea becomes, first, a form of knowledge in ordering system, which is then institutionalized, thus gaining legitimacy through the extensive use of sexual violence. The history of race is the history of slavery, colonialism, and race science. The various disciplines in the academy that rescue race from an idea and elevate it to a valid ordering and meaning-making system rely on sexual violence, sexual cataloging, and measuring the bodies of the project, as George Lamming and David Dabayin suggest. To call empire pornographic is to highlight the manner in which the project of empire is sexually violent and spectacular, or exaggerated, in its demonstration of power. Because we have to understand that rape is a system of power, is an exertion of power. It is an exertion of colonial power. It is an exertion of gendered power. It is an assertion of power of a strong group or a stronger person over what is perceived as a weaker gender, a weaker group, a weaker racial group, a weaker power of a language or race without talking about sexual violence. Race was made through rape in a direct, deliberate, and indirect way, as I will show. Critically acclaimed Kenyan feminist activist, poet, and theatre practitioner Shailaja Patel reminds us that when you want to understand how power works in any society, watch who is carrying the shame and who is doing the shaming. That is so incredibly profound and correct. Watch who is carrying the shame and who is doing the shaming. Because who does the shaming in our society? Patel is spot on. Shame is a function of oppression. It has everything to do with who is valued and who is invisibilized in any society. I like that she uses invisibilized, because people are never invisible. They are made invisible. People are never voiceless. They are silenced. Although logically, it would seem to follow that those who have something to be ashamed of and those who behave badly should feel ashamed of themselves, the opposite is actually true. Shame is a product of dehumanization, and all systems of violent, oppressive power produce shame in those they brutalize. Therefore, when Patel speaks of the following parts of shame as a reliable predictor of power, she points to shame as an expression of trauma, a relationship to debasement, which is why rape is used as such a strong show of power in wartime violence. It is used as a weapon of war. Because this seems so counterintuitive, let us look at a few examples. In white capitalist, white supremacist, heteropatriarchal societies, every form of degradation causes shame. So poor people are made to feel ashamed of themselves and their poverty, fed a daily diet of inferiority, laziness, and inadequacy. These messages that they are bombarded with, juxtaposed with the celebration of those who have wealth, mythologized as hardworking, more intelligent, and superior in every way, when actually it's the opposite. Poorer people are generally more hardworking. The wealthy have easy lives of abundance. The poor battle to make ends meet and often have to do without food, electricity, water, proper healthcare, or well-resourced schools. This juxtaposition and bombardment with the details of the lives of the wealthy manufacturer desire for the ease enjoyed by the wealthy. This part of the design of power. This desire seduces the poor into working harder and harder in search of the elusive ease, but no matter how hard they work, there are finite resources in the world. And those finite resources are owned by the few who laid claim to them through violence. Sometimes it's not violence that we deem, they didn't put a gun to people's head. What did they do? They stole their wages. They steal people's time. They steal people's effort. They steal people's souls. They crush people's spirits and call it profit. Therefore, wealth requires the hoarding of resources, which means taking away resources that would allow the poor to live decently in an equitable world. The mythology of violent power, however, casts the poor as inadequate in their ability to acquire obscene wealth and is a failure on their part. Repeated failure is designed to produce pain, powerlessness, defeat, and ultimately shame. This is not a natural process. This is how wealth is produced and justified. In different hierarchical societies, the structure is mythologized and naturalized differently. From industriousness, or hard work creates wealth, to religion, hierarchy is divinely sanctioned. To biological discourse, survival and the rise of the fittest. To heritage, ancestors earned privilege to be royalty. Race and gender work in the same ways. Part of violent gendered power is in celebrating attributes associated with masculine, in ordering the world in terms of opposites, binaries. If masculine and feminine are opposites, there's nothing in between. Then when the masculine is celebrated, feminine as its opposite needs to be debased. This means that those who are marked as feminine are also debased in relation to those marked as masculine. Debasement is another way of saying made to feel inferior. Through a similar process as for class structure in capitalist and feudal societies, patriarchy creates an inferiority complex in women that also depends on hatred for the feminine and therefore self-loathing. And then the discourse has been recently that men actually don't like women. They like to have sex with women. And that's it. They don't actually like women. What they are is in homo but not erotic relationships with other men. They are homoromantic, heterosexual. Through a similar process as for class structure in capitalist and feudal societies, I read that. Consequently, women spend energy fixing themselves since the full human is the masculine, and given the fact that women cannot legitimately attain masculinity, the best they can do is make themselves desirable for the approval of the masculine. When this approval is perpetually deferred, more work on the self is spent. We can never be good enough. We can never, ever be good enough under patriarchy because it's constantly shifting the goalposts. In the end, patriarchy produces a condition of women's unease in their bodies. It's constant unease. Manifestations include the awareness of women's bodies as dirty and excessive, which then need to be disciplined, hidden, worked on obsessively. From being told that their vaginas smell like fish, to being taught that menstrual blood and body hair are dirty, they curdle milk, rot meat, and contaminate others, to being punished for taking up space. Women are socialized to believe that there is always something wrong with us. Again, this is part of the plan. For as long as we are working on making ourselves less hairy, smelly, fleshy, and so forth, we are using energy to make ourselves smaller so that we have nothing left to fight patriarchy. It's not for nothing that the idealized feminine body in white supremacist capitalist society is one that looks tired, bears the evidence of being worked on. Tired, hungry, distracted women are easier to control. Hi, Taro. And they are already trained to work on themselves, blame themselves for inadequacies, even in the absence of sexual violence. With race, shame is produced through slavery, colonialism, and the conquest that comes from these. Enslavement, colonial onslaught, and conquest led to the breakdown of previously known patterns, rendering explanatory frameworks incapable of immediately explaining the changing world and the colonized's place within it. Reflecting on a range of slave societies, including the South African case, Gwen Campbell and Elizabeth Elborn introduced their collection of essays, Sex, Power, and Slavery, by noting how slavery was accompanied by ideas of honor and dishonor. Many of the chapters in this collection taken together seem to suggest that across the multitude of slave societies, there were links between slavery, the control of sexuality, including a slave's lack of self-ownership and corresponding obligation to provide sexual labor, and perceptions of honor and dishonor. Dishonor is another word for shame. Campbell and Elborn conclude from readings across these essays in their collection, authored by different contributors, analyzing varied slave contexts, and that all of them are characterized by the allocation of honor and shame. These meanings of shame and honor are authorized, created, and given power by the control of slave sexuality. In other words, shame is induced in the slave when they are unable to control their own sexuality. The obligation to provide sexual labor is rape. To be a slave is to be reduced to the status of object, dehumanized, denied will and self-ownership. It is layered with dishonor. Under these conditions, bodily autonomy is an impossibility, inducing further shame. Slaves' bodies belonged to those who had captured and bought them. Their masters and mistresses owned their bodies, along with their productive, sexual, and reproductive labor. When you are owned, chattel, constant and impossible, rape was a core facet of enslavement. Consent is impossible, To clarify the relationship between control of sexuality and Slavocratic societies, David Breon Davis is instructive. He writes that sexual intercourse can exemplify the closest possible moment of love, merging two humans in an equal sharing of joy with an equal sharing of genes that magically gives rise to a new human life, yet the same physical movements or moments can exemplify the most dehumanizing, degrading, and exploitative acts of conquest or warfare, including the infliction of the conqueror's genes onto the enemy group. Oof. Consent is impossible when there are power dynamics at play. There is clearly a wide spectrum of experiences between these two extraordinary extremes. Intercourse can be casual, commonplace, random, habitual, or even purchased. But despite this variation and diversity, the relationship between a slave and a free person, especially a master, could never reach the ideal level of the first model, since the slave, as chattel property, could never achieve even temporary equality. For Davis, sexual intercourse between two consenting adults can be a range of things from love to transactional to random and everything in between. Sexual violence is an act of warfare, tried and tested with success in many contexts. This is what Davis refers to. It performed on the body what guns and cannons enacted on the conquered territory. As Davis outlines, sexual control could only be violent between slaves and masters, never consensual. The rape of slave women was a routine part of slave societies from the Cape to the Americas, as much literature on slavery has shown. So when people say that Thomas Jefferson had a black mistress, a slave mistress? No, he didn't. He raped her. She bore his children, but he raped her. Even if she were white, she was 14. He raped her. There was never a love story between Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. What Davis points to here is the deliberate violation and forced impregnating of slave women as part of the experience of being enslaved, a surefire way for slave masters to increase their property and wealth without having to spend more money. This was not exception but a widely practiced rule in slave-based societies. At her Johannesburg book launch for Regarding Muslims, From Slavery to Post-Apartheid, Kabeba Barerun noted emphatically the manner in which we will remain unable to break the stranglehold of rape in contemporary South Africa if we continue to pretend that it is a recent phenomenon. In other words, if we are at all serious about making sense of rape's hold in our society, we need to interrogate the histories of rape in South Africa. To do so, we need to look back to the kinds of work rape has done in Slavocratic and colonial South Africa. For Barerun, it's not only important to recognize violence and sexual exploitation that characterized early Cape Townian slaveholding societies, but also the way we try to take seriously the trauma of slavery and sexual subjugation on which South Africa is founded. Raping slaves was an integral part of the architecture of slave-ordered Cape society. Note the place and naming of the slave lodge in Cape Town. Built in 1679, it served as housing for a total of approximately 9,000 slaves owned by the Dutch East India Company, prisoners and mentally ill people between 1679 and 1810. It was also known as the first brothel. The company, slave women, prostitutes. As slave status passed through the maternal line, all children produced by these unions were enslaved from birth regardless of paternity, according to Mary Caroline Cravens. Today, a Palestinian doctor spoke to us. He said that people coming back from Israeli prisons, the hostages that the Israelis take, every single one of them has been sexually violated in some way or the other, including children. This is colonial violence at its core. The ambiguity of the housing provided by the Dutch East India Company for its slaves is illuminating. The Verenigde Oostendisch Company, the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, was founded in March 1602 to enable Dutch merchants to challenge the Portuguese monopoly over the spice trade in Asia, as well as to better compete with British merchants. The Dutch gave the VOC rights to challenge whatever monopolies existed, while establishing its own, with free rein to colonize and enslave whoever they wished in Southeast Asia to devastating effect. Having decided in 1649 to establish a refreshment station at the Cape of Good Hope, the VOC set up a group of men led by Jan van Riebeck. Everybody, please spit at that name. If ever you hear it, if ever anybody talks about Jan van Riebeck as a great man and a pioneer, spit at it. The story of the wars, enslavement, and settlement by the Dutch under and after van Riebeck is well known. While free people had freedom of movement, slaves did not. Consequently, unless they escaped, they were obliged to live with where their owners housed them. In addition, given the fact that sexual coercion was part of the business of slavery, the use of the slave lodge as a brothel posed no contradiction within slave-ordered society. Note, that these were Christian men. These were men who set up church, ministries, converted the local populace by gunpoint, waited until their heads were bowed in prayer to steal the land. Although some historical writings suggest that the use of the slave lodge for this purpose preceded its use as lodging for slaves, most records show that slaves were resident in the lodge once it was finished. This, coupled with the extremely low numbers of colonial women at the time, meant that the prostituted were enslaved, and the enslaved were prostituted. Given the institutionalization of rape in slavery, at the Cape, as well as other slavocratic societies, there was no conflict between the obligational sexual labor provided by the slave woman as part of the lodge's function as a brothel, on one hand, and the kind of sexual warfare and forced impregnation of slave women described by Davis earlier. Since slave women's children belonged to their owners, the institutionalized rape of slave women benefited the Dutch East India Company. At the same time that the rape of slave women was routine within slavery, slavocratic society created the stereotype of African hypersexuality, which sought to both justify and authorize institutionalized rape of slaves. And they call us the savages. The stereotypes that held the slave woman could not be raped, since, like all Africans, they were excessively sexual and impossible to satiate. Therefore, not only were slave women objects and legally incapable of being raped, they were constructed as hypersexual and therefore would not have been rapeable even when free. This meant that even freed slaves could not fall under rape. At the same time that slave women were being routinely raped as a means to multiply their masters' slaves, slave men, especially when they were African slaves, were cast as dangerously sexual, with a ravenous appetite better suited to slave women, but with a particular danger to the innocence of white women. Such inversion was not unique to slave society at the Cape, but widespread, not only across slave-ordered societies in the New World, but extended into the colonial era, as I will show. Over the past decade, Gabeba Badirun has produced substantial work for her first doctoral thesis and later a book, as well as numerous articles that have painstakingly traced how the picturesque was developed to mask the persistence of violence enacted upon black bodies in slavocratic societies. For example, the pictures of beautiful landscapes, feminized Malay men and alluring Malay women hid the violence of slavery. As much as scholarship on empire and slavery specifically has shown, control of sex was central to definitions of race in colonies. Badirun argues, in Hidden Geographies of the Cape, the construction of an aesthetic at the Cape was concerned with masking the layered system of violence that lay beneath. Of course, because they knew it was wrong. They knew it was bullshit. They just did it anyway because they were shit people. And nobody ever tell me, oh, they were good people among the colonialists. No, not a single one of them was good. They were all shit people. And if you live in the former colonies or the neo-colonialist states, you come from shit people. Do better. In addition to the institutionalization of rape within slavery, various scholars have shown how developing a language of empire relied on an obsession with the sexual control of the colonized. This is clear in the obsessive regulation, cataloging, drawing, pathologizing, and mythologizing of sexuality. The language of empire beyond slavery was that of a sexually violent project. Zine Magubane's and Yvette Abraham's scholarship is particularly instructive on how rape was retained as a core feature of colonial conquest and rule. Sexuality was an important way in which colonial otherness was constructed. I need to read this book. Whether it be through the measuring and dissection of genitalia, as Abraham shows in her essay, The Long Great National Insult, an extreme example of which was Sarah Bartman, or as Zine Magubane shows her in painstaking tracing of how ideas about the colonial other evolved through the development of pseudo-medical or pseudo-racial science in her book, Bringing the Empire Home. If you want to understand what pseudo-medical and pseudo-racial science is, look up a man named Carl Linnaeus. He may be called Carl von Linné, but I refuse to give him that title because that's an honorific. Carl Linnaeus, who started the Swedish Institute of Race Biology in Uppsala, Sweden, which still stands today. This obsession with African genitalia and the creation of stereotypes of African excessive sexual appetites has specific effects. It reached through slavery and colonialism into the apartheid era. Traces of it can still be seen in contemporary global racisms. Any questions? Okay, if there are no questions, because race was made through rape and sexual difference, there was a constant preoccupation with slave-ordered societies with race mixing. While the rape of slave women was profitable, it threatened ideas of racial hierarchy and produced anxieties about race mixing. The institutionalized rape of slave women revealed a frightening possibility for patriarchal slave master classes of the unspeakable sexual intercourse between white women and slave men. This anxiety was about the loss of control over the bodies of their white women, as much as it was about the idea of white women becoming unpure. Anxiety over miscegenation, that horrid word for people procreating across race, is really an anxiety about rape. Saoirse Gunn and Zoe Brigley-Thompson remind us that, in thinking about rape, colonialism, and the construction of community or national identity, it is useful to note that in patriarchal society, racial purity and sexual purity are not mutually exclusive. As the male body or the female body is the locus for reproduction, it becomes a site of immense concern to the male patriarch. Whenever we have a conversation with a man who is so adamantly against abortion, this is why. It is about control of what they deem as their woman. Purity. The locus of reproduction is so concerning to the one who wishes to control populations. It is the fear of the white woman's body producing what the slave woman produces that creates the patriarchal anxiety about miscegenation, since the slave master is directly implicated in the project of violently impregnating slave women and producing the very miscegenation that he fears in his own house. Rape is such a core tenet of colonial rule that Gunn and Thompson also list examples of Spanish colonial armies celebrating conquest by raping and abducting colonized Native American women. Such was the case in Mexico. The idea that all black men are rapists came from this concern. Because what they said was, their white woman will never be impure enough to willingly have sex with black men and defile themselves. That is where it comes from. So whenever anybody tells you that horrible, ugly, just outright lie, that's where it comes from. This is because, as historian Yvette Abrams shows, dispossession has been a history of how rape, slavery, and colonialism worked in entangled and mutually reinforcing ways. In Was Eva Raped?, Abrams insists, in reconsidering the process whereby the Khoisan came to lose not only their land, but much of their culture and history, it seems to me that slavery and rape were two crucial explanatory mechanisms. Indigenous peoples the world over have been genetically genocided through rape. Whereas in many other places where slavery has left its ugly imprint, we have an archive of slave narratives. In the South African case, the lives of slaves come to us through snippets in court records, diaries, colonial journals, and letters. Because raping slave women was both widespread and not a crime, colonial record offers a challenge of evidence. Abrams and Patricia Scully write of an incident where a man convicted of raping a woman had the sentence reversed when the judge realized the woman was not in fact a white woman. We can deduce from similarities with slavery elsewhere, from the diaries and notes of abolitionists like Tom Pringle, who lived in South Africa and directly debunked claims by Caribbean and South African slave owners that slavery in these two places were milder than the most brutal instances in North America. We can also deduce much from the deliberate coincidences like the slave lodge being a brothel and population numbers. We can engage in informed and considered speculative historical inquiry, as Abrams suggests. She writes, how do you study a crime through sources which were assuredly not written by the victims and could have been written by the perpetrator? It is possible to theoretically deduce the occurrence of rape in general, but how do you prove the existence of a specific rape? It's hard enough today in court cases where the victim and perpetrator are still alive. The problems of studying rape in previous centuries seems insuperable. The studies I've used in this approach are subject to court records. However, this method is limited to cases where a charge was actually brought to court, an unlikely event in a case of rape by a slave woman, or in bookselling against a master. Slaves were objects to be used and thus could neither consent, dissent, or have a say in the manner of their use. In a legal sense, they could not be raped. Thus, the rape of slave women was unlikely to appear in court records. Scully's chapter on rape in a post-emancipation context shows that during some 30 years, only one case of rape of a black woman against a white man was ever brought, and this was dropped before it came to court. This was the case in the mid-19th century, must have been even more difficult in earlier periods. While it would benefit us to be able to speak about specific slave women by name in the same way that I sometimes do in discussions in other chapters, and as we are able to do as scholars of slave narratives when we have autobiographical narratives, the South African case presents challenges. For the purposes of this book, it will have to suffice to trace the threads and interpret what is available, to allow the evidence and read it against what else we know about Slavocratic societies. If the sources are unreliable, do we then just fold our hands and give up? In an essay like Three Tongues in One Mouth, I argue that there is, in fact, a possibility to learn various things about a woman who did not leave written records and who are largely filtered to us through records written by those who did not see them as human, saw them as partly human, or who were shaped by colonial ways of seeing the world. Abrahams argues similarly by showing how many aspects of Eva or Krotoa's life, as she comes through to us, rendered sometimes as inexplicable, can be made sense when we know some of the manifestations of rape trauma syndrome, or RTS. Researching a later epoch and a different region of South Africa, Robert Egerton has shown us the extensive use of rape as a weapon of warfare by the British as they advanced into various parts of what is now the Eastern Cape. In his book Africa's Armies, From Honour to Infamy, Egerton writes of how British and Boers' numbers motivated them to advance into Xhosa territory in the 1790s, an assault that was met and resisted by the Xhosa warriors, and the 100-year war that had been dubbed the 8 Frontier Wars in colonial lexicon. I want to quote him here at length to demonstrate various aspects of the relationship between colonialism and rape, and I do so attentive to what is problematic about lenses applied to interpret the specific moments and sequences narrated. In the 1830s, wide-ranging British patrols ravaged Xhosa lands, burning houses and crops and stealing cattle, driving the Xhosa further north and filling them with despair in response to British depredations that sometimes included rape and murder. The Xhosa bought firearms and powder and made ready for war. In 1834, another 15,000 men marched south, burning farms, making off with cattle, killing settlers. Even the brash and pompous commander, Sir Harry Smith, came to respect the Xhosa fighters as bold, intrepid, and skillful. Thank you. The fighting eventually calmed because the Xhosa chose to return north to care for the thousands of cattle they had stolen. More frontier wars followed during the years of guerrilla combat in which the Xhosa excelled. Despite their success in this kind of fighting, at which the red-coated British were at a great disadvantage, the Xhosa nevertheless came close to attack fortified British positions. In the early 1850s, they attacked a British fort over 5 hours before withdrawing with heavy losses. While their judgment in making such an attack can be questioned, their valour was never in doubt. Despite the escalating brutality of British troops and white volunteers who often killed Xhosa children throughout the entire century of warfare, the Xhosa were known to have killed only one white woman, by mistake, and they never killed any white children. There's a woman who was interviewed after being released by Hamas. She said that she was taken by Hamas, given clothes, given clean clothes, fed. She thought that they were going to rape her because she was practically half-dressed. They'd never touched her. And this, she says. Thank you so much for the support, everyone. Today we almost take it for granted that rape is an inevitable part and consequence of war. Part of what this passage reveals, and indeed many other instances in Egerton's book from different African colonial contexts, is the way in which the connection between rape and war is not automatic. It comes from a specific idiom, from the colonial archive. It is a deliberate investment in using sexual violence as part of conquest, not an accidental one. Because the Xhosa warriors came from a different logic, they avoided attack and retaliation routes that might catch women and children in the crossfire. This determination sees a frustrated Egerton earlier in the text wishing the warriors had attacked at night when they had an advantage. After poring over colonial writings from fiction to journals and letters from different parts of the colonized world, Anya Lumba writes of the manner in which, consistently in the European colonial imagination, the colonizer was represented as rapist and discovered or conquered land as the naked woman. Here we see that empire imagines itself as a rapist of land and people. Zionism is the same. Therefore, the centrality of rape as a weapon of colonial war is not an accident. Rather, rape occupies place of pride in colonial artillery, and Lumba continues. We have seen how the spectrum of representation encode rape and plunder of colonized countries by figuring the latter as a naked woman and figuring the colonizers as masters. But the threat of native rebellion produces a different kind of colonial stereotype, which represents the colonized as a usually dark-skinned rapist who comes to ravish the white woman, who in turn becomes a symbol of European culture. The stereotype reverses the trope of colonialism as rape and thus, can be argued, deflects the violence of the colonial encounter from the colonizer to the colonized. Every accusation is a fucking confession. And the person coming in who says, I'm always so depressing, go somewhere else. Fuck off. Understood variously as either a native reaction to imperial rape or as a pathology of darker races, or even as a European effort to rationalize colonial guilt, the figure of the black rapist is commonplace to be seen as a necessary or permanent feature in the colonial landscape. Education isn't happy, especially when you're unlearning everything that you've been taught. Like that guy who says, I'm so depressing, he doesn't want to learn. He comes in here all the time, just complaining about what I'm talking about. Instead of sitting and listening and trying to understand, he fights it. Because he is a white man. And he doesn't want to know the truth of his ancestors. Yeah. Lumba then proceeds to discuss a wealth of scholarship that shows the figure of the black rapist that takes on a particular visibility across various colonial contexts, especially in times of great anxiety about native resistance. And this is especially the case where there is no record of actual rape by South Asians or Africans. Thus, the colonial inversion is explained in Lumba's passage above, where she shows that European colonial literature wrote about colonizers as celebrated rapists of land and women from the conquered land, whether Africa, Asia, or the Americas. The literature is rife, and the earlier example of the Spanish colonists' celebration by raping Native American women is part of this motif. At the same time, the colonial imagination constructed the Hindu rapist or slave rapist or native rapist as a stereotype to manage colonial anxiety. Part of what this reveals is how deeply enmeshed rape and warfare were in colonial imaginations, because even resistance to colonial rule had to be thought of in these terms, even if evidence suggests that rebellions take different forms and not the rape of white women. In all senses, it is clear that the stereotype of the unrapeable black woman, along with that of the rapist black man, reveals more about the colonial consciousness and unconsciousness and predetermined ideas than what is likely ever to happen given patterns of resistance against colonial rule. I have 2.5 pages left. And we see it all over the world. What they call conquest, we call invasion. And the key here is, whenever sexual violence is spoken of, we see it as, they talk about it as conquering. Sexual violence is always viewed as conquering the other. And that kind of conquering was done over the land. They conquered and raped the land. They conquered and raped the people. And then created these mythologies to justify their anxieties. Welcome. Thank you so much. If the register of rape was introduced by slavery and entrenched by colonial conquest, it certainly had to take hold by the time apartheid was introduced. Thank you, Raiders. Thank you so much, Crow. I appreciate you. Have a seat and listen to the depressing talk. Crow Raid. Everybody give Crow a follow. Everybody who is in here, please give my friend Crow a follow. And also the Raiders, thank you so much. I appreciate y'all. Yeah, y'all came into a very, very depressing place to raid. Yeah, I see. Because we are talking about, everybody please follow the Proletariat, my comrade here who has, who teaches me a lot, who gives me a lot of, thank you, who gives me a lot of hope and education. It really is, AC. It must be spoken about because we tend to gloss over these kinds of topics because it's uncomfortable. That's why I never censor myself on these apps. Like, yeah, I know I have to for the Twitch title of the stream. Yeah, Crow's an excellent human being. I absolutely adore him. If you want to sit and listen, please do. But also, you can hop into the Discord and listen there. Yeah, they are. I mean, you know, they don't want us to talk about the things that affect us. Don't forget that Twitch is Amazon. Yes, Jeff Bezos, fuck you. Good, go read or write or whatever you're doing. Are you writing tonight? Reading. Okay, good. Take some rest. We all need to rest. Yes, fuck you, Jeff Bezos. All right. Back to the depressing stuff. Yes, you do. Let's talk about your book, though. I do want to talk about your book. After this, I need to talk to Manny. Somebody please share the live with people, because I didn't. I just didn't. But yeah, I do have 1.5 pages left of the book. Rape had become entrenched, and various other forms of violence assisted in strengthening the foothold. Jacqueline Koch notes that the South African Defence Force, the core of the military training, was to inculcate aggression and equate it with masculinity. That the army cultivates a form of masculinity that involves insensitivity, aggressiveness, competitiveness, violence, and the censure of emotional expression. The business of war had by now become associated primarily and sometimes exclusively with militarized projects of masculinity. Writing about the decade from 1983 to 1992, Jenny Irish insists that part of the understanding of the extreme violence of the era, 14,000 deaths, half of which were in Natal alone. Hi, Dr. Jace. Is taking into account the various ways in which such political violence was gendered. What I have traced is the manner in which political violence was always gendered. It is therefore unsurprising to read Irish's findings on the gendered nature of political violence in the 80s. The sexual violence she writes about may not be exclusively from white male colonists, but its targets, largely black women. It is violence that takes for granted women's vulnerabilities, such as the likelihood of being alone with children, the elderly in the home, unarmed, unable to flee speedily during massacres, as well as the inability to secure safety once they arrive in refugee shelters. She says this is because very often people are packed into venues and forced to sleep on the ground with possibly just one blanket. The women have no privacy and often become targets for sexual abuse and assault. One refugee camp on the south coast had at least 3 women forced to flee the camp after being raped by the men. Confidential discussion with other women in the camp revealed a chain of sexual harassment. Most women, however, are scared to report these goings-on, and some choose to leave the camp and sleep in the bush rather than put up with continued harassment. In a context where reporting rape also requires entering an additional layer of vulnerability and unpredictability, women who have been displaced by political violence, survived massacres, have no place to return to, are therefore in a particularly precarious position. Many other comparative texts have also shown where there is upheaval, conflict, and militarization, rape in particular increases. But when women report being raped by policemen as well, the likelihood of reporting and accessing justice retreats even further. And Jenny Irish writes, in at least 10 cases brought to the Human Rights Commission, women in the Durban area complained of being raped by one notorious policeman. I remember this case. One social worker dealing with some of these cases alleged that the man in question had raped the woman and the sorry. One social worker dealing with some of these cases alleged that the man in question had raped the woman, and from that point on, the woman would be called his girlfriends, and he would call on them when required. Oh, I remember this case. The women were told that they should attempt to refuse to cooperate with him, but he said their families' lives would be endangered. In some of the above cases, the women were faced with the option of continued rape or possible loss of family members. To make matters worse, those that were forced to accept these terms were then isolated by other members of the community because they were perceived to be the girlfriends of a notorious killer. The above uncovers the conditions of precarity as agents of violence power continue to brutalize women, placing us in even more dangerous positions, open to secondary victimization and shame, unable to access help, justice, and healing. In her essay, Rape in South Africa, An Invisible Part of Apartheid Legacy, Sue Armstrong writes, in situations of conflict, rape as means of asserting male power over women tends to increase in incidence and intensity. This has certainly been the case in South Africa, where the incidence of rape and other forms of gendered violence has soared. She further notes, until the abolishment of the death penalty, no white man had ever been hanged for rape, whereas only black men who were hung for rape had been convicted of raping white women. No white man or black man has ever been convicted and sentenced to death for raping a black woman. By the time apartheid was in decline, the rape of black women was so entrenched that it was extensively practiced beyond the ranks of state agents. Armstrong, quoting Heather Reagans from the National Institute for Crime Prevention and the Rehabilitation of Offenders, continues, when we started investigating, we discovered that rape, particularly that of black women, was so prolific in South Africa that it was just accepted by everybody. Social workers, doctors, policemen, and even the victim herself. A black woman's life was considered valueless, and what had happened to her unimportant. We wanted to question the assumption, rape is abhorrent and cannot be condoned, whoever the victim is. The rape of black women, as I have shown, was central to slavery, colonialism, and as is. As Sue Armstrong points out, the legacy of the past stretched out into the present. I'm going to tell you something that might blow your mind in the worst way possible. The statute of limitations for women of color to report rape was 3 days. Under apartheid. Three days. A legacy of the past that stretch into the present, beyond the boundaries of apartheid. I have not included examples here of women raped or threatened with rape in detention, although this was not uncommon. It has been my aim in this chapter to trace the development of rape as a weapon against women that is both widespread and not taken seriously. What this chapter has uncovered is how rape became such a powerful language with which to control women in South Africa, and the scale of it. And as the last few examples show, it is a language that is now an established part of South African power. Yet with all of its history, Desiree Hansen continues that in a context where both theory and research suggest that black women who are raped by white men and rape survivors do not fulfill the stereotypical male definition of femininity are discriminated against within the legal system, it is vital that the impact of recent rape reforms on differentially oppressed women be evaluated carefully. Perhaps this should not be surprising, given the fact that criminal justice is based on Roman Dutch law, the same law that once rendered black women unrapeable in a phenomenon Jane Bennett calls the metaphorical deafness in her essay Enough Lip Service. She defines metaphorical deafness as a strategy of colonial and patriarchal approaches to gender that refuses to engage with concrete realities in which gender dynamics play a fast and furious role. And people refuse to acknowledge the role that racialized gendered expression and gendered representations play in all of this. Just how can we build on the societies that were not built for us in the first place? How do we expect justice within those societies? Mystic, I fucking miss you. How can we expect those societies to work for us? Like Bennett, I suspect the way out of these histories demands reorientation, unfamiliar relations to power, and seemingly irreconcilable choices. Black women are the most likely to be raped because of these combined histories about who matters the least, not because of specific essences of black men. It still bears nothing that across categories of men, not just white colonialist men, rapists rape women, longest burdened with assumptions of unrapeability. Still, all women are in danger of being raped. And that is the chapter. Any questions? You can put them in the chat. And for those of you who are new to these readings, I'm reading Rape, a South African Nightmare by Pumla Gqola, who is a brilliant researcher, writer, activist, and friend. Don't forget that I do these readings for free, so please, if you can, donate to my PayPal or Ko-fi links that are in my link tree. You can subscribe to my podcast, which is $1, $5, $10, or $20 a month, depending on how much or little you have to spare. Any amount will do. If you can help, you can choose any of the links that I have in my link tree to support. I have Crow's shop in my link tree if you want to support the Proletariat, and a whole lot of other people's there. I have reading lists, and you can get access to my Discord. For any of you who are on any of these channels, I have a TikTok, Discord, Twitch, YouTube, and Patreon. So please follow me on all of those and catch you on one of them. And that is it for the readings for this week. I'm going to end the Twitch and YouTube and Discord thingy me bobs now. Thank you for joining me, and I shall see y'all on Tuesday, same time, different book. And have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. And to those of you who are involved in the pro-Palestinian circles here in Johannesburg, see you at the Mandela lecture on Saturday, where, we'll be listening to Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur to the colonized Palestinian territories, speaking about the report that got her sanctioned from the US. So please, if you can, tune into that, if you can tune in online. But I'm going to be there. And then going to a gala dinner, which is complete juxtaposition, because there are people starving in Gaza, and I'll be going to a gala. It's kind of wild. So if you want to talk about cognitive dissonance, there's something right there. But I shall see y'all on Tuesday, and see y'all on the TikTok streets. I'm going to be remaining on TikTok for the next couple of minutes. So if you want to, you can join me there. If not, good night, and I hope you dream of your favorite dinosaur when you